my voice is. Today's speech, I'm refuting Kaylee's speech that all college athletes should not be paid other than athletic scholarships. The points she made were athletes are essentially already paid with the scholarships that they receive. Changing the system to receive direct pay would be too difficult. It would put unfair pressure on the student athletes, and Title IX requires that pay for women's sports is on par with men's sports. Those were her points. My first point, athletes are essentially paid already. She brought up the point that tuition, room, and meal plans are part of their pay. That doesn't really have anything to do with college athletes on scholarships. If you receive a scholarship, you're gonna get some tuition paid for, your room, and meal plans. I mean, that's not exclusive to college athletes on scholarships. She brought up the point that free coaching, strength, and fitness training, well, that's, if you're not on an athletic scholarship and you're still a student athlete, like, you still get that kind of services, so it doesn't have anything to do with the scholarships that they receive. According to FindAid.org, 1.8% of undergrads receive athletic scholarships. So the majority of people who are under a undergrad program are not under an athletic scholarship. So there are very few people that are playing college sports that are actually on an athletic scholarship. The average scholarship, according to NCAA, is $10,400, which is for their entire time there. And the average cost of NCAA schools costs between $20,000 and $50,000 a year. So the portion that they receive for financial aid, I mean, there are very few students that receive full rides. I think there's only 4 sports that offer full rides. It's football, men and women's basketball, and then women's volleyball. So there's not a lot of full rides out there. It's a common misconception that you receive like a lot of financial aid. The second point is changing the system to include direct pay would be too difficult. I think because something is too hard doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. Just because it's difficult doesn't mean we should just give up and not try to do something if it's a better system. And then also that there's enough money in the athletic scholarships to, award some kind of direct pay or extra financial aid for student athletes. Just football alone brings in a good portion of the athletic department's money. The top 10 schools the football program provides more than 60% of their athletic scholarships. So she made the point that only a few sports bring in actual revenue. There's enough revenue they're already paying for almost the entire athletic program. The Georgia football program brings in $75.2 million of the $91.7 million in the entire athletic department. That's 82% of the total department. So they bring in quite a bit of money. The Texas football program brings in $104.5 million of the $163.3 million that the entire athletic department provides. Her next point was that it puts unfair pressure on student athletes. The NCAA requires that you get a 2.0. She brought up the example that some coaches require more, like a 3.0, but that doesn't really explain what added pressure would be on the athletes if we went to a direct pay system. That pressure is already on them. They're already under that amount of pressure as student athletes. And again, it doesn't have anything to do with whether they're on an athletic scholarship or not. And then Title IX requires men and women's athletics to be on par. She kind of explained Title IX and that it requires an equal amount for women's and men's athletics. 57% of athletic scholarships, the money for athletic scholarships are given to men. In 11 of the 14 sports with men's and women's teams, the women's team averaged higher amounts per athlete. And that's it.
So you know I had a full ride for soccer, so that sport was.
Full ride for the field next spring.
Well,
So you're wrong.
okay, whatever.
I got that full ride debate scholarship.
Really?
That's athletic. That's not athletic.
Wait, you really did?
Yeah.
That's pretty sweet.
Yeah, the last 2 years. Last 2 years.
Nice.
Cause like a walk-on.
Did you have to debate to make that happen? Or?
Yeah.
And that's kind of how they were like, oh, well,
At SC, that's the way it happens. I don't know that it happens that way anymore.
Well, I wonder
The
if
world
they give,
changes.
like, scholarships for, like chess club or something. I can learn.
I was looking at it this
I don't
morning.
know,
There's
dude.
scholarships
It's
for like
really
men's
good.
rifle.
So good. It's like,
Yeah, riflery, and then like women's bowling. There's scholarships.
yeah.
I mean, they're not full rides, but
My little brother was in chess club in junior high
Really?
for just a short period of time, and in that short period of time, he like couldn't beat the
Got
kid.
really good.
And he's 5 years younger than I am. That made me so mad.
I don't even know.
I'd like flip the boards.
Chess is hard, dude. Cause that's how I get with ping pong.
I love it.
I love it, but I
Okay,
suck at
I
it.
was in the Dominican Republic for like 2 weeks, and all we had was ping pong cards. 2 weeks. I got so good at ping pong. I was beating those Dominican girls, and they're all like, it was so funny.
I'm going Hollywood
I
tomorrow.
was like, it's crazy. But they don't really understand because they don't speak English, so it's really funny.
She's like Forrest Gump. Representing fun.
I feel like 3 o'clock in the morning, just like playing games.
All right, Bob, you did a good job laying out the advocate's main and secondary claims, and you followed the organizational structure pretty closely, so I appreciated that. Sometimes you just ask questions or you kind of make assertive statements. For instance, this whole argument that says that the scholarship issue isn't really relevant because you're expected to get that as part of a scholarship. I'm going, well, okay, but why is that not the equivalent of giving somebody some compensation for what they're doing already? It seems like you're just dismissing that without an explanation about why the argument that the advocate presented is not a legitimate argument. Now, I think that there are value arguments associated with that, and both you and the advocate stayed out of that for the most part. But the question might become, what is appropriate compensation for the amount of time and effort that's put in here? But nobody develops any of that. So, for instance, if you're on the volleyball team, I don't know how much they practice every week and how many hours it involves in training and participation and those sorts of things. But would the scholarship come out to something that was the equivalent of reasonable pay, for instance, compared to what the scholarships are for the football team? That might be one way of looking at that issue. I do think that you have a good argument that talks about the limited nature of scholarships, how they represent a very small proportion of the total students going to college. But of course, the advocate is only talking about whether or not athletes should get those, so it would only apply to those particular people. And I'm not sure how that then undermines the advocate's point that those folks don't, that providing them the extra money is unnecessary because they're already compensated reasonably. Now, I think you make this argument that says that just because something's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't try it. Well, if it's not worth trying or if it's going to destroy us in the process, I think that would be problematic. So, for instance, if we are only giving scholarships to a small percentage of athletes and we can barely afford that, adding pay on top of that seems to cut into the amount of money that would be available. I mean, I'm thinking 2 steps down on that argument that the advocate might make in response to this. I just don't know that your issues are going to undermine the claim substantially enough. The example that you have, Georgia and Texas, I like the data that you got there, but the inference seems to be that because those programs bring in all of the money, that then it's appropriate to be paying those people. But of course, if we were paying that group of people on top of the scholarships, what would the ramification be for the rest of the programs? I think that's the argument that the advocate is making, and that you're not really responding to that particular point. You're just telling us what the percentage of revenue is that's generated by those particular groups. If there's an argument about whether or not it's fair, that's a value claim. But what the consequence of it would be, I think that's the issue of fact that needs to be developed a little bit more. I didn't really understand the argument when it was originally presented about the pressure that these people face, and I didn't understand your summary of the argument about the pressure that they face, and I didn't understand your refutation of this argument. I'm not sure why it's relevant, how it affects the judgment that we ought to be making in these situations. So that just seems to me like it's a lot of effort that's been made on that doesn't mean much. The Title IX issue, I think you've got half of an argument here. Basically, what you're arguing is that the money is being divided appropriately. What the advocate is suggesting is that you could not pay just the athletes in those four, or in the one sports, because you have to spend money appropriately, like it has to be divided appropriately between the men's and women's sports. So if we're paying, I don't know, whatever it is, let's say $3 million in compensation money, I don't know, paying the athletes on the football team, for instance, that would mean that we'd have to have $3 million that we were paying on the other side, and that's one of those arguments that says it's going to cut into the revenues, and that's why it's hard to do, because it is expensive to do. And your argument simply points out that they'd have to do that. It doesn't really say that we could afford to, or that would be safe to do. So I think that you address most of the issues, but I'm not always sure that it's clear what your claim is saying in regard to those issues and how it undermines those points. And I appreciate your speaking, despite the fact that your voice is apparently about to die.